Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Master Gardener webinar. Tonight, we will be talking about how to prep for your summer veggie garden. Thank you so much for joining us, and let's get started.
Here we go. So I'm going to talk about summer veggies and how to prep your garden, really with it focusing on the way we do it at our garden in Walnut Creek. And when I say our garden, I mean the Master Gardener demonstration garden located in Walnut Creek on Shadelands, not my home garden. Okay, so what I'm going to go over tonight is going to stay really grounded, talking about bed prep and soil prep. And so what you can be doing now in the preseason, assuming you were all at our great tomato plant sale the last 2 weeks here in Walnut Creek, and you have a tray of plants ready to go in the ground, what prep could you be doing now? And then I'm going to talk about what to do in season, how to protect your plants and how to protect the soil and maintain your beds. And then a few thoughts on postseason, what to do when your summer crops are done. Where do you go from there? What I'm not going to talk about, because we already have great talks on that on our YouTube page. The address for that is Coco MGUC. That's our YouTube channel. I saw a question already in the Q&A about fertilizers and amendments. I'm not really going to go into that in any detail tonight. We've got a great talk on that that's already available on YouTube. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about irrigation, just some basic principles, but not about how to set up a water system. We've got a talk on that, and as well as talks on planting and planting your plants. So first off, I want to start with a little historical context. So, 2 Christmases ago, I ran across these 2 books that one written in 1911, one written in 1940, and both of them talked about soil fertility. One is called Farmers of 40 Centuries, and it was about a University of Wisconsin professors' studies in going through China, Korea, and Japan and how they maintain soil fertility despite living on the same plot of ground, usually having less than 2 acres, and have that remain fertile for generations. And then a related book written by an English advisor to India in 1940 called An Agricultural Testament, where he had the same questions. What were they doing in India that they might be able to bring back to Great Britain? And I know you're thinking, so, okay, this is how you spend your Christmas vacation? Yeah, well, yeah, it kind of is. So off we go. So the lessons from those 2 books, the author of The Farmers of the 40 Centuries could see the Dust Bowl coming to the US, written in 1911, and was looking for solutions. They were already seeing depleted soils in Eastern farms, despite them being much bigger than they were in the Asian countries. The US farms were typically 20 acres, averaging about 20 acres. And looking for solutions for that. In An Agricultural Testament, that author saw what happened in the US with the Dust Bowl and did not want that to happen to Great Britain. And so what possible solutions could he find in India that would help them out? And it really, in both books, it came down to the same thing. It's maintaining soil fertility by aggressively adding organic matter from many sources. In the Asian countries, they were shaving clover off the hillsides, carting it down in baskets, and then tucking it into rice paddies, manually tucking it into the ground. And then also moving silt out of the canals up onto the banks, and then spreading it across their agricultural fields to add fertility to the soil. They had their children following oxen carts and to gather up manures that they could add to their compost piles and add to their soil as well. So really, they describe it as not a stick or a twig or a leaf going to waste to build fertility back into this organic matter back into the soil. And they were doing something similar in India, but instead of it going straight into the soil, they had something called the indoor process, where they would dig these large trenches and compost animal manures and all kinds of green material in these large composting areas, and let that break down until it was ready to be applied on their fields. And so that's how they were able to maintain that soil fertility. And we were doing nothing like that in the US. So what enabled them to do is longevity of production without relying on additional fertilizers. Fast forward 100 years. So this is a brochure, a pamphlet that was put out by the USDA about 10 years ago. And it's called Farming in the 21st Century, a Practical Approach to Improve Soil Health. And it covers the same points that these authors talked about 80 and 100 years ago. And I realize this is too small to read here. So the key points are managing soil health by disturbing the soil less, meaning not tilling, diversifying the crops that go into that are planted there to get a variety of roots to attract a variety of insects and a variety of beneficial organisms through crop diversity, keeping the soil covered as much as possible. So some speakers will call it armoring the soil, where you're protecting the soil from the weather, from wind and rain, erosion, compaction, and so protecting that soil as much as possible. And then having growing, living roots in the ground year round. There's kind of a myth out there about fields have to rest. Fields, you have to rest garden after planting it all summer. No, what you want to do is have that soil active and engaged year round if you can. And it will enliven the soil, it will enrich the soil, and it'll be healthier and you'll get better production from it. So there's a quote in that pamphlet, which I think it's kind of strong for a government document, but here goes. Tilling the soil is the equivalent of an earthquake, hurricane, tornado, and forest fire occurring simultaneously to the world of soil organisms. Simply stated, tillage is bad for the soil. And that was in the first publication of this about 10 years ago. So you say to yourself, well, what does that mean to me? I'm just looking to grow a few tomatoes and peppers. I'm not farming. I don't have a tractor. What does this mean to me? Well, what it'll mean to you is less work. So you'll spend less time prepping your beds each year. It's less expensive. If you're using less fertilizers, you've got fewer inputs to pay for there. You end up using less water, which is very important these days. And in the end, you'll end up with healthier soil, which will mean healthier plants, which will mean healthier produce. So let's do a few definitions. If you've watched a number of our talks, you've seen this before. Soil, what is it? How do we define it? So soil is made up of minerals, organic matter, air, and water. And the percentages are roughly 45% minerals. Minerals being essentially broken down rock down into anything from pebbles to sand to silt to clay. 5% organic matter roughly, and then 25% air and water. So the way I kind of look at this is half the soil is solid and half of it is air and water passing through it, through the solids. How do we define organic matter? This is right out of the Master Gardener Handbook. So material derived from plant and animal residues in various stages of decomposition. So here's a tale of two soils. The soil on the left is a shovelful from our garden in Walnut Creek, and the soil on the right is a plowed field I stopped by along Highway 80, but you can see that anywhere along the farmlands on Highway 80 or down Highway 5 or 99 in California. The soil on the right, you can see it's aggregated, it holds together. You can see it's kind of clumpy and holds together. You can see it's alive. There's one earthworm there that was too slow to get out of the way of the picture. The other one stuck out quickly. You can see it's very dark and rich. And some people will describe rich soil or good soil as moist chocolate cake. And it does kind of look like that, very rich looking. The soil, on the other hand, on the right side, is very tan, very pale, very sandy. It would not clump together. And in digging in it a little bit, I really didn't see much life in it. So it ends up being kind of a growing media once chemical fertilizers are introduced. So with that, let's start looking at some of the steps in prepping. Again, this is the process we go through at our garden. So what we do is we clear existing material, whether that's plants that were in the ground from the season before, or whether it's a cover crop that was grown in the given bed, or could be weeds. We don't have many weeds these days, but mostly cover crop and previous crops. So we'll clear that. We'll aerate the soil if needed. We don't really do much of that anymore. We'll amend the soil as needed. We'll top dress with compost, and then we'll double check the moisture before planting. So clearing the existing material. In the picture in the center there is a bed of fava bean plants. And so they grow very large and lush. And we use it as a cover crop. We don't let it mature into fruiting into a bean state. What we want is the nitrogen nodules that are on those roots to stay in the soil. And so when that plant starts flowering and then developing fruit, it starts pulling that nitrogen up. And we want to leave that in the soil for our own planting. So what we'll be doing is chopping that down. There's two ways we can go on that. It can go to our compost bins. These are actually the compost bins at my house. We have a whole composting area at the garden. Compost in place where we're going to chop it up and put it right down on top of the soil. Our choice between the two tends to be timing. So ideally, we'd like to leave that to compost in place and let all that work that's done by micro and macroorganisms be done right there in the bed. But sometimes we're looking to flip a bed in a day. And so we will take off that green matter and it'll go over to our composting area. And I don't know if I said it at the start, but we're not pulling these plants. We cut them off at the ground level, leaving the roots in the ground to decompose. And so here's the steps for that composting in place. Chop it up relatively small. Pieces are probably 1 to 3 inches. Chop it up relatively small, spread it out evenly on top of the bed, add a layer of compost on top of that, maybe an inch or so. and then we cover it with burlap. And I just got this question on Instagram on our page the other day. What's the burlap for? Well, we use the burlap to keep the moisture in and keep the sunlight out. And so what'll happen is it'll stay much moisture underneath there. And if there's any plant stems that are thinking about continuing to sprout, that won't happen because we've shut off the light there. You can do this mulching with other materials. You could do it with leaves if you put them on 3 or 4 inches thick, or straw. But we find that doing it with burlap bags is a really neat and tidy way to do it. So we can stack them right on and peel them right off, and then we reuse them. So the next step is aerating the soil if it's needed. So what we don't want to do is get in there and turn the soil over. What you're doing when you do that is you're disrupting all that structure that's been put in place by the earthworms and everyone else that's kind of burrowing through that soil, the air and water channels that have been created over the course of a season. You'd be knocking all that down if you're digging up the soil and flipping it over. The other thing that happens is any dormant weed seeds that could be in there, you're exposing them to air and sunlight and moisture that could have them sprout. So we don't want to do that. The reason you'd want to aerate the soil is if you're not getting decent water percolation there. So on the left, we've got a broad fork, which is what we used to do. On the right, we've got just a standard garden fork, which is probably what you'd be using at home. Back in the original days of the garden, we used to double dig, and essentially what that's doing is digging out a trench of soil there, say putting it in a wheelbarrow, mixing it with some kind of amendments like compost or something else, and then putting it back in the bed. In doing that, you're destroying all the structure that's been created. So if we're going to broad fork, we're doing it just to improve the water percolation. An easy way to check that is dig kind of a shallow trench, fill it with water. If the water percolates right in, you really don't have to do much other aeration for that. You should be okay. And you can do the same thing with your garden fork on the right side. The way to operate the broad fork is you step on that crossbar and pull the red arms back towards you. And so it really just kind of slices the soil. It's not turning the soil. What we do want to avoid is using a rototiller. That goes back to that original quote from the USDA there. So you're just chewing everything up if you're using a rototiller. Now, there are instances where like if it's a brand new garden you're putting in and that soil is hard pan clay, which we can get in this area, in this county, a rototiller might be really your only choice. When our garden in Walnut Creek was first started 12 years ago, the hard pan soil was so hard there that the rototiller actually bounced off it. The blades wouldn't penetrate. So that's an instance you're going to need to use a rototiller to break that soil up just to get started, allow water to percolate in and loosen the whole thing a little bit. That when our garden was first started, the soil was so hard they had to use an auger to drill the holes to put in the fruit trees. So this may be useful for maybe the first season or two if you're doing a brand new bed, but after that, I would avoid it if you can. You want to let the soil mature and develop on its own. Our next step is amending the soil. And as you'll hear in many master gardener talks, we recommend starting with a soil test. I know they can be kind of expensive, somewhere $50 or $100, but how many bags of $20 fertilizer are you going to save if you don't have to amend? So what we typically find in this county is that our soil can be a little light on nitrogen, but tends to be okay on potassium and phosphorus. So do we really need to add that stuff? We may not, but a soil test is going to tell you that. It's kind of like going to the doctor and saying, just give me all the pills. Well, you may not need any of these pills. Well, yeah, just give them all to me anyway. I'm just going to take them all. So if we don't have to do that, we don't want to do that. We want the soil to work on its own and let the microorganisms in the soil develop it for us. So typical amendments or additional amendments can be compost or manures. We use a lot of compost at our garden. We don't really use any manures. Kind of the challenge with using, say, horse manure or cow manure is you really have to know your sources well to know what they've been eating, to know what the corrals or the perimeters of the corrals have been sprayed with, or the fields have been sprayed with. You want to know all that stuff. And so we, as a general rule, don't use manures. We add a little to the compost we make sometimes, but that's usually only very mature manure that's been sitting at least 6 months, better yet, a year. So when we do use fertilizers, we tend to use an all-purpose organic. We follow the directions on the package exactly how it says to do it. So for instance, with a really heavy feeding plant, like for instance, tomatoes, they may say to put in, say, 2 tablespoons in that hole and stir it around before planting the plant. And we really follow exactly what it says there. So a little more is not better, a lot more is even worse. So follow the directions on the package. And so you can see on the right, if we're kind of generally fertilizing a bed, we will broadcast it as it shows there. And for the fertilizer we use, it's 8 cups to go on a 100 square foot bed. So you can look at it, and it's really just a dusting. So, and if that's what it calls for, that's all we do. Because you don't want to do this. This is what happens with an over-fertilized citrus tree. We actually had a case at the garden, the sale 2 years ago, where a guy came in and bought 8 or 10 plants, took them home and planted them right away. He came back to us a week later and said, I don't know what happened. All my plants died. And so we started asking him some questions. How did you water it? Okay, he was watering it properly. How did you prep it? He prepped it fine. Okay, how did you fertilize it? He says, well, I spread 1 bag of fertilizer over the bed. So the typical bag is 3 pounds. His bed was half the size of what our beds are, where we use just 8 cups. So, of course he burned his plants. So follow the directions on the package and you'll be much better off. Just to briefly touch on the numbers that are on there. So the first number is nitrogen, the second number is phosphorus, the third number is potassium, and that's percentage by weight. So it kind of makes sense. So just the nitrogen, one way to think of these things is nitrogen is what sends the plant up, phosphorus is what sends the plant down, and potassium is what sends the plant around, kind of developing fruit and flowers. So for a starter fertilizer, we're less concerned about plant growth to start. We want to get good roots going, and we're certainly not concerned with fruiting at that point. So 462 kind of makes sense. Some people want to use just a balanced fertilizer, keep it simple. So basic 555. And then just for contrast, I show a bloom fertilizer where you're not concerned with plant growth. So just 3 in nitrogen. but you are concerned with putting down good roots and getting good flowering or fruiting to kick in. So real heavy there with 2020. Okay, so at that point, we're ready to top dress the beds with compost. So you can see on the left, we've got that dusting of fertilizer put down. And we want to put like 1 to 2 inches of compost down. And some people will lightly rake it in. We don't. We want to disturb the soil as little as possible. So we will put on those 2 wheelbarrow loads of compost and just rake it smooth. And then we'll check the moisture and we'll be ready to plant. So when checking the moisture, we want to start with moist soil. And we want to, in both the ground and in the plant you'll be planting. Because what'll happen is it'll seek equilibrium either way. So you go to plant a well-watered plant in dry ground, it's going to tend to wick that moisture out away from the plant. And the other key point is we want to be watering the soil, not the plants. So we use drip irrigation on our beds. It's really the best system for getting the water where it needs to be, right on top of the soil. And so we want to be watering the soil because we want those roots to grow as full and as far as they want to. And if you're just holding a hose at the stem of the plant, or you just got a little emitter there doing that, that's not going to happen. That's not going to do that. It will seek moisture wherever the moisture is. And so if we water the whole bed, we're going to have better plants. You can kind of do the same thing with sprinklers, though they're really the least efficient method. I know none of us do this, but we've seen neighbors that have sprinklers spraying the street or water run into the street. You know, ideally, we don't want to be doing that. We want to put the water where it needs to be, and drip and actually hand watering are the 2 ways to do that. If you're watering by hand, it's a very intentional way to do it because you're looking at the whole bed, checking to see what needs water, and it's time consuming, but you're going over the whole thing and making sure it gets the water it needs. And then really the most important point of all these on the moisture of the soil is, regardless of your watering method, it's not a set it and forget it. We'll hear this once in a while at farmers market tables, at our Ask the Master Gardener tables. Well, someone will say, well, yeah, my watering's fine. I've got timers. My drip irrigation's fine. It's on a timer. Well, yeah, but do you know that timer's set right? Do you know it's getting water where it needs to be? You really don't. So at our garden, we will randomly check beds every week and adjust the time as needed every week. Because I mean, if you just think of our weather in the last month, we've had some sunny days, we've had some almost warm days, we've had some pouring rain, we've had some wind. If you're just setting it for the season, that's not going to be good enough to water properly. So how do we check that water moisture, that soil moisture? There's a couple ways to do that. You can use a moisture meter, and that's got a graded scale on it that will go from dry to wet. And the way it measures that is it measures the conductivity of the soil. The wetter it is, the more conductivity it has. And so those work pretty well, but you can't really see what's going on in the soil. So my preference is the other 2 methods. So you can check it by hand, where dig down 6 inches or so in the soil, pull out a ball of soil and see how wet it is. So create a ribbon in your hand, like shown there, and squeeze it together. And if it's moist enough, it should hold together. If it's too wet, you'll be able to squeeze water out of it. And that's a really simple test. So if it's moist enough, it holds together. If it squeezes out water, it's too wet. Probably my favorite of the three is to use a soil probe. It's similar to creating a ribbon by hand, but what you're doing is you're taking a core sample, depending on how big your soil probe is. This is a little 1-foot one that I use at home. We've got an 18-inch one at our garden, but you twist it down into the soil sample. And so what you do there, what you're hoping for is to have consistent moisture down that whole soil sample there. That's ideal. So, but say for instance, the first 3 or 4 inches are dry, and then it's only wet down on the bottom 2 inches. Well, that's telling you the top of your soil is drying out. You may need to water more frequently. On the other hand, if just the top 2 inches of the soil is wet and everything below it is dry, that's telling you you're not watering deeply enough. You may be watering frequently enough for short root plants like lettuce or cilantro or something like that. But you're not watering deep enough for your deep root plants. You're not getting it down to where the root ball is. And so the other thing to consider is crop diversity. And so the only time you see monocrops is from man's hand, right? So fields of sunflower, fields of corn, fields of soybeans. And what happens with that is you attract all the pests that are worst for that crop. You get fewer beneficials there because they can be attracted to all kinds of different plants. And you only attract certain organisms in the soil for those plants. So that's what happens with monocropping. And ideally, we want to make the planting as diverse as possible. So while we this is our family, but we call our family bed at our garden. It's one bed that we kind of set up like, let's say you've got 100 square feet at home. You've got a 5 by 20 area, and that's what you're going to plant. What can you get in there? And so we plant a really diverse array of crops in there. So you can see this in this small picture. We've got red and green lettuce. We've got, I think that's garlic in there. We've got Swiss chard in there. And I can't tell what that is up the right side. That's something else different again. But we'll really put a bunch of different things in there. So you attract all kinds of beneficials. You've got all kinds of root depths there that can feed the soil after the plants come out. Much greater diversity ends up being healthier soil. And so to give you an idea of some of that root variety, so like the little shallow roots of lettuces only go down 6 inches or a foot, where you look at tomatoes, those roots can be a couple feet wide and 3 or 4 feet deep. So you want to be watering deeply enough for deeper plants if that's what you've got there. So watering deeply enough. You may end up watering less frequently, but you want to make sure you're getting all the way down through the roots. If you're watering less frequently, say you're watering heavily, I don't know, say 3 days a week, that might not be enough for the shallow rooted lettuce, so the topsoil starts to dry out a little bit. So you may have to hand water some of those plants on those in-between days. And this is a great picture that I think it's a meadowland that this has been going around the internet for years, this picture. And it shows the diversity of plants that you can have and the diversity of root systems. And so some roots can go down very deep and some roots are relatively shallow. it's great when you cut those plants off to leave that organic matter in the soil to decompose and continue to feed the soil. Just as an example, this little brushwork over here on the side, that's your typical turf lawn. So it is 3 or 4 inches high, maybe 6 inches deep, and that's the extent of the system, the lawn system in the soil. Okay, so the next point we wanted to cover was keeping the soil covered, and that's adding mulch. Here's a couple different kinds of mulch. We do straw at our garden. We buy it by the bale, and it's really easy to use that way. And we just fluff it up a good 2 or 3 inches deep around the plants. Here we got a bunch of pepper plants. In the middle is what I've done at home for years, which is I get a lot of leaves in the fall, and so I save them in big wire bins, and I'll crumple those and use those mulch. And that only really takes about an inch of those to cover the soil well and moderate the temperature and keep the moisture in. And another thing you can do is use wood chips. So it presents a very tidy appearance. Can be a little bit of a nuisance in raking that off after you're done. You don't want to turn it into the soil because it will actually kind of suck the nitrogen out of the soil if it gets buried. So say you're going to top dress that bed after those tomato plants come out, you would rake off those wood chips and then top dress the soil, and then the wood chips go back over. The leaves actually kind of decompose and are really kind of gone by the end of the summer season. And the straw ends up kind of rolling up like a mat. It's relatively easy to peel off at the end of the season when you want to address the beds. But here's the difference it can make. This was at our garden. I did this a year and a half ago, and it's all in the same bed. And I had an infrared thermometer. It was a day in the high 80s, 85, 87, something like that. And I put the thermometer on bare ground, uncovered ground. The thermometer showed 132 degrees. And at 140, organisms start dying, right? That's what you have to, that's the minimum heat you've got to get when you're cooking something, is to get it over 140. So 132 degrees. Even the straw itself was 126 degrees, the picture in the middle. You brush the soil, you brush the mulch off, and you can see the soil underneath it is damp, darker than the picture on the left, and the soil was 75 degrees, which is that perfect temperature range you want for peppers and tomatoes. So that's the difference that mulching makes. It moderates the soil temperature and helps keep moisture in, so you're able to water less. So now let's talk a little bit about postseason. So this on the left there is a wine barrel that I had a tomato plant in. And so similar to what we did when we composted in place on that bed at the beginning, I'm doing the same thing with this wine barrel. I chopped up the tomato plant very small, lots of little bits there. And just as a caveat to this, you don't want to be composting in place diseased plants. If there's any kind of disease in that tomato plant, you want to throw that in your trash, not in the green bin, throw it in the trash. But this was a perfectly healthy plant, and so I chopped it up, covered it with compost for a couple of weeks, and then planted this broccoli in there. And then there was some other stuff in there. I think I had some thyme in there, and these are some little lettuce seedlings. So put in a second crop, just like you could do in your beds. And in the middle is a mixed cover crop that you can also put in. This is a picture taken at our garden of a variety of mustards and phacelia, and I'm not sure what else is in there, ryegrass or something. But a mixed cover crop, you could do the same thing in that raised container as you could in the ground. So in summary, in the pre-season, you want to build the soil while disturbing it as little as possible. We don't want to turn it over. We just want to aerate it if necessary and skip that if it doesn't need it. So you're getting less work and less expense, less prep involved there. You want to protect the soil from, in season, you want to protect the soil from the elements while providing a diverse variety of plants the moisture that they need. So using mulch and water only as needed. And then in the postseason, we want to keep roots in the ground and to keep your soil active and alive. And in the end, you're left with healthier soil, which is going to give you healthier plants and give you healthier produce.